Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year. But the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in Miami, Florida, and you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share.
One summer in Chicago, I thought that I was pregnant. This was long ago, and it was when abortion was illegal all over the United States. And I knew that I would not be able to have that child and raise it in goodly ways. That was very clear, for a whole lot of reasons that would take way too long to talk about right now, but it would just have been very bad for that little person to be born. And so I thought, well, okay. And I had never been, I sort of always knew, the people I knew, the way I was raised, the thinking atmosphere of my life was such that I immediately thought, okay, I'll need an abortion. I didn't say, oh, what should I do? I knew what to do. The question was how to do that in a situation where it's illegal and I didn't know anyone personally and so on. So I thought about it, of course, and then I realized I had a friend who was a medical student. And I thought, oh, of course, he'll know. And he was someone I could completely trust. So I called him up and told him that I thought I was pregnant. I was pretty late. Pretty late in the sense that my period was pretty late. And he said, oh, I'll ask around. I'll see. I'm sure somebody here knows. And when he called me back, which he did, bless his heart, in just a day or two, I mean, really fast, which is, of course, exactly what we need, he said, everybody here, meaning at the medical school, University of Illinois Medical School in Chicago, says, call this number and ask for Jane. And I thought, okay. And it turned out that it was this underground group of feminists, women who were committed to women's integrity as human beings, and also what we would now call reproductive justice, in the sense that these women understood that it was enormously important for women to make decisions about whether to make people or not in any given instance, and generally speaking. But I had never heard of them until my friend, the medical student, told me that at the medical school, that was the advice they were giving, which just blew my mind, because I thought he was going to tell me there was some doctor there who did it, or I thought maybe he would know how already, but he'd only been there for about a year. Anyway, so I called the number and left a message. And this was in the time. Now, of course, people leave messages in clouds. In those days, it was unusual, and there were people who were afraid to make recordings, and we didn't even have the word voicemail yet. That wasn't even in the vocabulary yet. But I called, and the machine answered, and I left a message, and a woman called me back again, very next day, and she said, this is Jane. And of course, she wasn't named Jane. Everyone used that name. And we talked for quite a while, and I was extremely interested. I mean, these women were doing this amazing thing, and I was fascinated by it, and I was impressed. And I thought they were admirable, in any case, whether I needed an abortion or not. And she said to me, you know, you really should have a pregnancy test, because why go through this unless you're absolutely sure? And I thought, the arrogance of youth, I guess, I don't know. I thought, for sure I'm pregnant. Well, actually, I wasn't that time. I wasn't. And I just had the latest period in the history of the world or something like that. And so I called her back and said, you were right, and I don't need an abortion, but thank you so much. And, you know, I think it's so wonderful what you're doing. And then, and again, we talked for like 45 minutes, this total stranger calling herself Jane and me. And she said, you know what? We're going to be taking in new members in the fall. This was in the middle of the summer. The year was 1970. And she said, why don't you come and see? So I did. There was a whole lot of stuff going on in my life in those days that was extremely important for my education as a human being. It turns out this became part of that, my education as a human being. So in the fall, I did go, and the meeting was in a small church in my neighborhood, just a couple blocks from the apartment where I lived on the north side of Chicago. And there were, I don't know, maybe anywhere between a dozen and 24 women there. I don't remember exactly now. And there were a couple of them who were Janes, and the rest of us were people who were interested in one way or another. And they gave us a sort of information briefing and orientation. Now, mind you, this is all illegal. And there we are in church. It's very important for people to know this history so that it doesn't look like what the anti-abortion movement likes to tell it as. And I joined right up. I was knocked out by the integrity and intelligence and the political purpose and, of course, the kindness of the enterprise. So within a week, I was at a meeting, and at that meeting I was assigned to an experienced Jane, and with her I sat in on her counseling sessions. Women who had come to the service, as I almost, or not almost, but as I was planning to do when I thought I was pregnant, would be assigned to a counselor and go and talk with her and find out how the process worked, give some personal medical information, and so on. And so I sat in and learned, as any intern does, really, by being next to, if I was learning open heart surgery, I would be the intern or the medical student next to the person performing it. Well, just so with learning to counsel. And then over the next many, many months, I also learned medical procedures and learned, I guess you could call it office work, although it was an underground office. We had the phone answering machine, which was this big thing. And there was a beeper that you used to get the messages back from the phone. It was so primordial compared to what we have now. But it worked. It worked. And it was good for women that it worked. So ultimately I was a member of the underground abortion service in Chicago for 2 years. And during that period, like any student or learner, I incrementally got better at stuff. I did the telephone stuff. I did counseling of individual women. I learned how to induce abortions in women who were more than about 13 weeks pregnant and help them to miscarry. I learned how to do early stage abortion. I sat in on many abortions as the woman who was assisting, because you would be the person using the medical instruments one time, and another time you would be the woman sitting on the edge of the bed and holding the woman's hand and talking to her if she was afraid or if she felt the pain, and all of those things. We met every week, and at every meeting there would be these file cards, 3x5, like what you would use if you were taking notes in those days in the library. And on each of the cards there would be a woman's name and then the basic information that she had given in that first telephone contact to the Jane. In some cases it was me who had called her back when she left her message on the telephone answering device. And so at every meeting we would talk about business. We would talk about, was there a problem? Was there some issue that needed to be discussed? Scheduling, all of that. But all during the time that we were talking, these cards were being passed around the room. It was an extraordinary thing, really. And you would look at the cards and you would take the ones that you thought you could counsel most effectively. And sometimes there were cards that just kept going around and around, and no one took them for a long time because they were so painful and difficult. But ultimately, every card was taken because that's what we were doing. So periodically there would be a situation that would be now I will say, I didn't think of it in these terms then, decades ago, but there would be situations that now I would say are like extraordinary examples of why it is crucially important that abortion be available in those situations where a woman or girl has determined that that is what she needs. The youngest person I ever worked with was 11 years old. And I thought, 11? 11? I mean, you just, how do you let that into your mind? Now, of course, again, now I see that there have been internationally known cases, situations, where little girls have been raped, and governments and churches have attempted to make them carry a pregnancy till term. Some of them are so small that they couldn't possibly carry a pregnancy to term. I was just rereading some stuff in the wonderful magazine from the Catholic organization, Catholics for Choice, and they have an excellent magazine called Conscience. And I was reading some old issues to remind myself of stuff for research, and I read about a couple of these stories, one in Europe and one in South America. And you stop and think, what can they possibly imagine would justify making an 11-year-old child go through a full-term pregnancy? What is the rationale there? And of course, all the rationales about life and God and everything just aren't even in the same universe as the life of this little girl. So anyway, the youngest person I ever worked with was this 11-year-old, and her mother came with her, of course. Her mother was a nurse who luckily understood a great deal. And so I remember her very well. I remember, you know how over a long period of time, the things that come into your memory or that your memory conjures up are surprising. Here's one of the surprising things I remember. This woman, the mother, when she came, she was wearing white gloves, and she wore her purse over her arm, and she was dressed beautifully as if she were going to a luncheon. And her child, the little girl, was also dressed very neatly and cleanly. And for some reason, this picture of them, and especially the mother's purse and gloves, that's what rises in my memory. Something about her desire to present them as a pair, a mother-daughter pair, in a certain way, which of course for my needs, she didn't have to bother, but for her needs. And I thought, it's so poignant, you know, it's just heartbreaking, really, to think about their situation. And then I have this memory image. Anyway, so that was a notable case because she was so young. Many of the women that I worked with as a counselor or an abortionist or assisting abortionist were people who did not have the kind of money that would have gotten them a private abortion with their own doctor. That's one of the things I really, again, I hadn't thought about it in the earlier years of my life, but once I began to do this work, I realized, well, of course, women with money can get abortions. They always have been able to get abortions, no matter what the law is, no matter what country they're living in, and they always will, because that's the deal. We know this. So the women who came to us were not in that position. They weren't necessarily poverty-stricken, although there were plenty of seriously poor women who came, but they just didn't have that kind of money. They couldn't fly to Japan in 1970, or fly to Puerto Rico, or fly to London. These were places that women with serious money would just go, or go to their own doctor on Michigan Avenue in Chicago, who would charge $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 and refer to it as a therapeutic D&C. My favorite thought about that is it certainly was therapeutic. And good for the women. I'm not saying, I'm not here to diss those women. I'm just saying that the connection to their economic class level is integral to our understanding of who gets what's available, with or without law. So the first year was all of this stuff that I've been talking about training and learning and counseling and working. And the second part of the second half of my time was one of the relatively unusual situations, because even though the service had been in existence for a couple years, roughly 68 through 72, between 4 and 5 years total, because within 6 months after the Roe decision in January of 73, the service dissolved itself. But anyway, in those years, we were illegal and underground, but as in the case of my friend, the medical student, lots of people knew about the service, which they called Jane. We, the Janes, we just called it the service, because its whole name, its full formal name was the Abortion Counseling Service of the Chicago Women's Liberation Union. No one was going to call it that, of course, including us. We called it the service. And over time, and now that the history is out in the world of medical history and women's history, feminist history, people generally call the organization Jane, and all of us are called Janes. So let me think, where was I going with this? Oh yes, in the second year of my time, and it came in terms of personal timing, I took a 4-month break, although I did some telephone stuff and a couple of individual meetings, but because I had a child on purpose. I did it on purpose. And I still have him, although he's 42 years old, and that's on purpose too. Anyway, there was another Jane who was pregnant right at the same time I was. And actually that was, I'll take a little sidetrack here because I think it's politically and gynecologically and feministically interesting. When this other woman and I told the group that we were pregnant, there were Janes who thought we should quit and not work when we were showing. And there were Janes who thought otherwise, including us, the other Jane and me. And our argument was, what we want for women is that they be able to make decisions about their own lives in terms of childbearing, and we are not ashamed or embarrassed. We are not pregnant by accident. The whole thing is, here's this set of possibilities for women. And after heated, I was going to say conversation, but let's call it argument, because that's what it was, the group decided that yes, we would stay. And we did. So I had been off for a while. And then I began doing little things, coming back. And the very day that I did my very first full day of work, and that day, because we all, or almost all of us did many tasks, I was the driver. Because what we would do is women would come to one address, and sometimes they'd leave their kids or their mother or their husband or their lover or their friends who came with them at that place, which we called, appropriately enough, the front. And then they would be driven by the day's driver to another place, which we called the place. And I was the driver on the very first full day out in the world as a Jane. And that's the day that the Chicago police busted the service. So even though we were well known, certainly the cops in the neighborhoods where we worked knew us, and they sent people to us. We may have even done some police women, I don't know. Certainly their wives, daughters, lovers, mothers, whatever. I mean, the police are just as various as everybody else. And they knew that we were not hurting anybody, and that we were not in it for the money. And we were not the mob. And the mob never bothered us for the same reason. We were so penny ante, in their opinion. What did they care? Whereas they always moved in on people who were doing it for the money because they wanted a cut. So anyway, we did get cracked. And there's a whole story behind that. I don't know if we have time, I could tell it, but it's not really crucial. The point is that for some particular set of circumstances and reasons, that's the day we got busted. So the 7 Janes who were working that day, me and 6 others, we then began to, the way I think of it always is, instead of studying medicine, we were studying law. And so we had to find legal assistance and learn about what our case would be and how we wanted to present it and how it would all go down and all of that. And we also knew, anyone who was paying attention to abortion law in those days, in those years, knew that there were cases making their way toward the Supreme Court of the United States. And our case just dragged on, so to speak, purposefully. Our lawyer, the woman that we did ultimately choose to work with, I'm sure saw to that. And so the Roe decision came before we even had to decide. So that rendered our case, void, so to speak. Moot, anyway. So I had learned all this medical stuff and was doing this to me, and I know this, to all the other Janes, work that was deeply satisfying because it met our political, social, cultural, emotional, spiritual standards for how a woman, a human for that matter, is supposed to behave in the world. And then suddenly we were these people accused of multiple felonies, because when abortion is illegal, it's criminal homicide, felony homicide. People need to be reminded of that when they think about laws changing. So I was one of what immediately was called the Abortion 7. And there were buttons that said Free the Abortion 7 and, all that sort of thing. And so the 7 of us would have separate meetings. And we even had a little retreat. There was a woman in Chicago who, with her husband, owned a small farm up in Wisconsin, and they gave us the farm for a long weekend. And so the 7 went up there with our significant connections. I took the baby. And that was an extraordinary experience for me. There were a few of us of the 7. 3 or 4 of us were mothers, and I was still nursing. And so the whole day and the time when they put us in the women's lockup overnight, I was thinking, they'll take my baby away from me, as well as having to milk my breasts into the filthy little sink in the cell. And, it was, you couldn't write something like this and people would say, oh, come on, but it actually happened. So there was an enormous amount of what I have to call deep education for me. And as I say, I know this was true for other Janes. There's just no question. You can't do something like that and not be in a constant movement of learning, constantly stimulated to learn, to figure out stuff, and to analyze stuff and to argue with yourself and your comrades. Okay, what about this? What, like we argued about, should the visibly pregnant women be working with the women who come for abortions? What does that mean? Will it make them feel bad? Well, very serious considerations. All of that, constant, deep learning, no question. Some of the, I've been to school a lot. I have initials after my name. I got degrees here and there. But this learning is as deep as you can imagine learning to be. A great gift, really, I feel. We were lucky, really, to be afforded an opportunity to do righteous work in the world and have it be meaningful at the level that our work was, and also teach ourselves at the same time. Talk about, that early poetry collection by Marge Piercy called To Be of Use. We were of use. And it was enormously important to our development as humans, as conscious women. There was an argument similar in depth and importance, similar to the one about should these two pregnant Janes continue working through their pregnancies, when the Roe decision came down at the end of January in 1973, and the argument was, should we close up or not? And some Janes said, we should keep doing this because our purpose, our goal, our interests are such that we will always be doing good for women. We will never be in it for the money. We will never run them through like some kind of conveyor belt like happens in clinics and hospitals and doctors' offices for that matter. So often for various reasons, abortion and everything else in the medical system and medical industry in the United States. And that is, of course, a very heavy-duty argument. On the other hand, once abortion is legal, then if you're doing it the way we were doing it, you are practicing medicine without a license. And that's not a great idea in itself, whatever the medicine is you're practicing. So it was very seriously debated. Also, people said things appropriately, I think, like, look, we're good, and we've been doing this. They're going to be new. They're going to hurt people. Why should we stop? This is good work. And that's a very persuasive argument. But ultimately, the other argument was equally and then more persuasive. And several women who were Janes went to nursing school, at least one, maybe more. One that I know personally went to medical school. And several became involved in the founding of a women's clinic in Chicago, doing alternative, quote-unquote alternative, meaning an alternative to the medical industry's offerings, alternative medicine. The Emma Goldman Free Women's Health Clinic, or a name very like that, was named for Emma Goldman. And whatever the rest of the name was, her name I remember for sure. And others over time did other things that were in some way related to or sparked by what we had done in our Jane work. And that is certainly true for me. I'm a writer. I've been a teacher of many kinds over decades now. I taught women's studies in the 70s. And after that as well, when I went back to graduate school, I went late. I started at the age of 41, but I graduated at 46. And in that doctoral training, that doctoral education, everything I had done as a Jane was present to me, even though that wasn't what I was studying. For a while, I thought maybe I'll be a midwife. But the fact is, I'm a word woman. And even though I was good at what I did in the underground service, and I'm proud of that work, I'm a word woman. So I did not become a midwife. Although, I'm not dead yet. I suppose it could happen. But anyway, and then my own abortion interestingly enough, was a Jane abortion, even though abortion was legal. It's actually a little embarrassing with all that I knew. And I knew a lot about contraception and about gynecology and about women's reproductive health, yet I did manage to get pregnant inadvertently, which just goes to show you that it can happen anytime to anybody. Oh gosh, really, it is, as I say, still a little bit embarrassing even all these years later. But anyway, it happened. And I was in a situation where having that child, my own child was still quite young. This was a year after Roe, so the baby wasn't even 3. He was a toddler. He was certainly toddling by then. And I had very little money, and every woman's list is specific and yet general in the sense that these are women's lists of reasons that we decide, okay, I'm not going to do this one. It's not good to do this one. So I thought, and I did get a pregnancy test right away this time, and it was like 5 weeks because I acted instantly and I knew everything this time. And so I called a good friend who was a Jane, a woman I had been working with in those years. And she came over and did me on my own bed with my lover right there holding my hand. And I say, when people say, well, how was your abortion? I say, I had an A+ gold star abortion. I was in complete control of my situation. It was in my own home. The practitioner was a friend and comrade and colleague. I knew everything about the procedure, having done it myself in other women's lives and with other women's bodies. My partner was there with me. It is what we want for everyone, really. And that early, of course, it's a very simple procedure. Now, of course, we have medical abortion, and I've mixed thoughts about that because I'm sort of anti-medication. But I do know that there are many, many, many circumstances in which that is a great gift, having medical abortions. Like, for instance, Women on Web, the work that Dr. Gompertz has done, both in the boat and online, extraordinarily useful. Places where what is really the best is not available, and so there's this, and it's good, and it works. But anyway, in my case, even though I could have legally gone to a doctor or a clinic or a medical facility of some sort, why would I? I was, possibly for the only time in my whole life, a privileged person in that I had access to this wonderful, loving experience. So my abortion is unfortunately unusual. I say unfortunately because that's what I want for every woman and girl who chooses to end a pregnancy. And so what we want is to get as close to that as possible, both in the level of comfort and kindness and knowledge, and in the level of skill and appropriately applied medical training, whatever the circumstances, whether a woman is 5 or 6 weeks like I was, or 13 weeks, or far along, or in some desperate situation way far along that is just horrific and dire necessity for all the awful reasons that we all have heard and read so much about.
So I really want to know, how'd you get busted?
Okay. Well, the story that we the Janes, gathered, figured out, or heard, or were able to get about why and how we got busted is this: that there was a woman coming that day to have an abortion who had told her sister-in-law what she was doing. Now, maybe she told because she knew her sister-in-law was anti-abortion, and really she was ambivalent and she wanted somebody to stop her. Or maybe she didn't have anybody else to tell, and so she told someone that she knew was iffy, but she needed to talk. Maybe she was very nervous and didn't even realize that she was talking to someone who was anti-abortion. We'll never know. But we do know that one of the women scheduled that day told her sister-in-law, and her sister-in-law called the police in a neighborhood in Chicago that wasn't even a neighborhood, like as we said, well, who are these cops? These aren't our cops, which is to say, these are not the police who work in the neighborhoods that we work in. Who are these people? You know, what are they doing here? And what had happened was that the woman who called, who blew the whistle, she called her local, well, which you would do, you know, she called her precinct, and who knows why. So she called the cops. We assume, because they weren't in a neighborhood where we had regularly worked, there were a couple neighborhoods in the city of Chicago where we always worked. And when I say worked, here's how it went. I mentioned the front and the place. These were people's homes. These were apartments. Sometimes it would be a house, but mostly it would be apartments. And these people would go away for the day, take the kids, take the cats, and just give us their place, their home to use for the day, which in itself is an extraordinary gift and a wonderful sense of camaraderie among the people. So we would have the apartment that the folks would come to that I explained, and then the apartment where the abortions were being done. And the police were given, because that was the only address that anybody ever had, the address of the front. That was the one the sister-in-law knew about, because that's where the woman who was signed up for an abortion was coming. And I loved this. I heard this in court because, you know, I was the driver. So when they testified in court, they said, well, we had to follow her several times. I thought, yes, because I was doing all this diversionary, you know, because even though we really sort of knew that at any moment we could get busted, mainly we thought, well, it could happen. And we had a rule, don't go to work without a lawyer's phone number in your pocket. But at that point, we knew that so many of the police approved of us that we weren't thinking that way, even though it was sort of tucked into the back of the brain. So I was practicing diversionary tactics, you know, going in strange routes down small streets. And he said, we lost her a few times. And I thought, yes, it's because I did what I was supposed to do. But then, of course, they just kept following me. And at some point, they saw, because I was going back and forth, where both addresses were. And actually, the very first thing they did was get me, because one of the women that was, I've actually written about this in a few places. It's in one of my books or one of my stories, maybe. Anyway, there was a woman who came that day who had a 2-year-old who was having surgery at Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago. And her husband, the little girl's dad, was at Children's Memorial for her, and the woman was with us for her abortion. And she kept thinking about her little girl, of course, and she asked me, do you think you could take me back as soon as I'm done? Or, because she understood that the deal was that I would wait till 5 or 6 women were done and then I would take them back. And I thought, oh, why not? You know, she's so anxious. The child is in the hospital. So I said, sure. So we left, just the two of us, and I was going to take her back. And we were waiting. The place on this occasion was in a, it's again, way too long a story, but at some point we had gotten this apartment to use. And it was in a high rise. And so we were waiting outside the elevator. It was coming up, coming up, coming up. Doors open. We step aside, like you do, to let the people get off. And these guys got off. And we didn't even really notice them. And we started to get on. But they were the police, and they grabbed us. And she, of course, was terrified. She didn't have the, training and pep talks that I had had. And I said to her, you don't have to say anything. The law allows you to remain silent. And of course, as soon as they heard me say that to her and saw her burst into tears, they knew that I was, in their terms, a perpetrator, and she was, in their terms, a victim. And so they set us aside. And then they went and got the others, and they went to the front, and they arrested everybody there, which was like 40 people, women and children and men, and took them all down to the precinct. I'm sure they were not so pleased with themselves when they realized they had to do that. Eventually, because they didn't know who was a Jane and who wasn't, and of course they wanted these people to testify against us, which no one would do. No one would do. And also, every single one of those women, I don't know all the details, where they were interrupted that day, they got their abortions. The service managed to either do it ourselves really, really, really undercover in the next week or two, or collected money to send them other places. In fact, there's one woman in the documentary film who tells the story. She was coming through on that day, and she tells the story about being given a plane ticket and sent to Washington, D.C. Yeah, for free. I decided to share my story, as you ask, because of these things. One is that I had the great good fortune to be part of an extraordinary set of circumstances and work with an extraordinary group of women and do good work in the world that is of importance to women's history, particularly in relation to reproductive justice and the needs of women in terms of contraception, abortion, all kinds of healthcare related, adoption, childbirth, pregnancy, nursing. All of these things include that history, and that history is not necessarily readily available. So I am happy to have this venue, this opportunity to tell people about these things, and also say to them, you can go online and go to libraries and bookstores and find information about the underground service. And I actually, I'm going to add this as well for that part, not only because it is crucial that women and girls know our history, but also because in most of the United States right now, I'm saying this in March of 2014, in most of the United States right now, it is very, very difficult, not technically illegal, but very, very difficult for women and girls to get abortion health care. And this is, of course, an outrage. And I want us to think about what we need to do. I want us to think about what law is and what justice is. And I want us to think about how women and girls, and actually men and boys as well, in history and geography, have taken steps, have taken action that isn't technically legal in order to do what needs to be done. The obvious examples in the United States, where the economy of the nation is rooted in a history of slavery, are, of course, all the laws about slavery. In the state of Oregon, where I live, for instance, there was a law called the Lash Law. When Oregon came in as a state in the 19th century, the government, the people voted to come in not as a slave state, as a free state, which sounds good, except that the reason that Oregon came in as a free state was that they didn't want black people in the state even as slaves. And they created this law that said, not in these exact words, but very close, and you can look it up, that if black people did come to Oregon to live, they would be whipped publicly with lashes every 6 months until they left. That was the law. So people who say that the law in capital letters is somehow in itself a sacred thing are not taking into account what laws are. They are somebody's ideas that have been politically instituted, and they need to be examined. They need to be judged, and sometimes they need to be broken. So that's one reason I wanted to talk about this stuff. And another reason is that I think it is useful for us. It has been enormously useful for me since my mid to late 20s, when I first started being a conscious person, and certainly conscious as a woman. Enormously important for me to know the stories of other women's lives, rather than just what I was told those stories ought to be, or might have been, or should have been. And so I'm just adding mine. This is my, drop in the big bucket. And I think that these stories are part of that learning that I talked about earlier, the big education. So those are my two main reasons for wanting to accept this excellent invitation to be part of this podcast. I think that the podcast is a terrific idea for those reasons, especially the second one. And some people are desperate to tell their stories and don't have space for it. Luckily, partly because I'm so old now, but that's not my situation. But that too, crucially important. My abortion decision shaped my life in certainly more than one way. I'm sure that's true for every woman and girl who makes that decision. I had a small child and very little money. I figured that if I wanted to have more children in future, and I wasn't sure that I did, but I wanted to have that option, it would be, making the decision to have more children would be not this accidental situation, which is how I got pregnant. Also, I thought a lot, this is probably because my first real grown-up job was as a high school teacher, and so I thought a lot about raising children. I worked with these, and I was very young when I started. I went to college, I got the degree, then I became a teacher. So I was really only a few years older than a lot of the people who were my students. So I had all those years, those early years, of thinking about what it means to raise children. How do you do it? How do you want to do it? And with my little kid, my toddler person in those years, in the early 70s, I was working very hard to be mothering on a daily basis, on a constant basis, in the way that I wanted to be a mother. And I was certainly not always successful because of being an actual human being and therefore fallible, and also not being alone and being, in the sense that other people acted on me and my kid. But I was doing a pretty good job, and I was really pleased with that. I thought, okay, this can be done. But then I thought, well, if I have another one right now while he's so small, and I'm not going to have any more money, and I'm not going to have any more time, I'm just going to have two of them instead of the one, I won't be able to be the kind of mother I've been thinking so ferociously about wanting to be all this time. That was really important to me. That was seriously important to me. Now, I'm not saying I was like the world's greatest mother ever, but I was good. And I was good because I was conscious and deliberate, and because I thought about things in those terms. Like, okay, how to do this, how to be this. And since I didn't have the baby and had the abortion, the following year, when I was continuing to think, will I make more people or not, I decided not. Because I looked ahead. Now, you can never know what the future holds, but you've got to go with what you've got. You know, the information you have in any given moment is the information you use to make the decisions you have to make. So, given what I had, I thought, I'm never going to be a rich person. I'm not looking to have the kind of life, you know, I wasn't, what's her name? Angelina Jolie. You know, I knew that I wasn't of that inclination. Many, many children. And I decided, no, I'm not going to have more children. And I'm going to apply the amount of time, energy, mind, emotion, passion, love that I have for my child to this child and this situation. And that's what I did. Also, now, many years later, I think, well, if I had had more children, I don't know that I would have begun writing when I did. And I don't know if I mean, maybe I would have. But it would have been harder, iffier, for sure. And I suspect that I wouldn't have had as much energy and thought for my son, because I would have had to divide it up. Now, that's not terribly ugly. I mean, certainly I was raised by people who were raising 3 children, and, you know, it wasn't ugly and awful, luckily. I know that lots of families are. That's one of the things we've learned in the last 40 years is how terrible family life is for so many people. But I was not one of those people. So I had good examples before me. So I could actually say, oh, well, that was fun. Me and my brothers, that was cool. I could do that. I decided not to, but I had this good example. So having the abortion and having it as an influence moved me into this area where I saw myself, you know, like, what do you want to be when you keep growing up? And I thought, I want to write. This is how I want to spend my human energy. And I want this little boy, and I want to have a good relationship with him and be good for him and to him. And those are my 2 main shots. That's what I've got going on here. And if I hadn't had the abortion, I think that would have been far more difficult for me.
For more information about the Abortion Diary podcast, visit us on the web at theabortiondiarypodcast.com or email us at info@theabortiondiary.com. If you'd like to share your abortion story, visit our website, click on Share Your Story, and leave us a message. Thanks for listening.